Welcome, everyone. As we get started today, I want to welcome you. My name is Cyndy McDonald. I am the hostess for Friday Forums. This is something that I started when COVID started, just as a way for us to connect, keep in touch, and keep abreast of things that are going on in our world, in our community. We cover both education topics and business topics, and I interview subject matter experts from all over the world to talk about things that matter to you. And I'm so excited to have our guest today, Robert Schaeffer. He is the director of Fair Test. He's been with fairtest.org for many years. Welcome, Robert. I'm so glad to have you here today.
Thanks, Cindy, and welcome all participants.
So as you're coming in, if you've been to my Friday forums before, you know we want to know about you. So use the chat and put in where you're from so Robert can see the great audience that we have. We have almost 400 people registered for today. And so give us your name and where you're from so that you can see each other a little bit, and Robert can see where you're all from. So we've got Wendy. Welcome. I'm glad to see you, Wendy. I have no idea what time it is in West Africa, Ohio, Texas, Colorado, Hamburg. You see all these places: Hawaii, New York, California, Florida. So Bob, you have an audience that's been eager to listen and hear from you. Just so exciting to see both all the states, the cities, and the countries that we have. And now that we're past Thanksgiving and ready for the holidays, the Christmas and other holidays, we're really glad to have everybody here. So let's go ahead and let's talk about, what Fair Test is, and tell us how you what prompted the creation of Fair Test. I know you're celebrating your 35-year anniversary. Tell us what got Fair Test started.
Well, Fair Test was founded by leaders of national education reform, civil rights, feminist, and student activist organizations to serve as the nation's independent watchdog over standardized testing, literally from cradle to grave, from kindergarten entrance tests to employment certification tests like nuclear power plant operator, for which I hope the passing score is 100%. And it came into being after a conference up the Hudson River from New York City in 1985, where leaders of those groups came together. Many of them had been working on testing issues and problems, but there was no organization solely focused on that. And they pushed very hard to create Fair Test as the National Center for Fair and Open Testing as the organization to focus on all that work. We began working on college admissions issues like test optional in the late 1980s. Personally, I got involved because I was kidnapped. The person who founded Fair Test, who's now moved on a number of years ago, knew me from other work in Massachusetts where I lived and knew that I had been involved in education and testing issues. I had worked at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Education Research Center with a prior generation of testing reformers. And he brought me aboard in the beginning to help launch the organization, and I haven't been able to escape since.
So in this year in 2020, it's brought new awareness to systemic racism in the US. How does this relate to the work that you're doing at Fair Test? I think it's very interesting because it's almost gone full circle, right?
Yeah, it's very important and a key component of our work since the beginning. I mean, we like to say that Fair Test has one foot in the civil rights community and one foot in the education reform community. And where they come together is around the use of high stakes standardized tests to make decisions about educational opportunity that end up, unfortunately, reinforcing the structural barriers that already exist in our society. In terms of the ACT and SAT, all the counselors out there know that scores correlate very strongly with family income and other measures of socioeconomic status. They correlate with race because race correlates with socioeconomic status in the US. And when you rely on those tests to make decisions like who gets into college, who wins so-called merit scholarships, who gets into honors programs, you end up skewing that pool very much in favor of kids from affluent and white families.
So, and how, expand on that a little more. How does that show up and what can be done about it?
Well, how does it show up? It shows up most crudely in scores. It shows up more indirectly in the demographics of those who are admitted to college, particularly highly selective colleges that rely on test scores, and most vividly in scholarship programs that use test score cutoffs. National Merit, for example, a couple decades ago, Fair Test brought a civil rights complaint against National Merit, and it's the Educational Testing Service and College Board who run the SAT because of gender bias in that competition, relying on PSAT scores, which are skewed by race, gender, and income. Young women do better in college than their male counterparts when matched for identical coursework, yet they score lower on the SAT, PSAT, and to a lesser extent on the ACT. So either all the colleges in the country are wrong about what academic readiness is, or the tests are wrong. And we forced a settlement there that somewhat leveled the playing field in terms of gender. In Florida, where I live now, the Bright Futures Scholarship, so-called, which has SAT, ACT cutoffs, skews the funds which come from low-income taxpayers, largely lottery money, and give it to upper middle-class white kids because it's based on test scores, and those scores correlate heavily with family income. So you're taking money out of poor, low-income minority communities and giving it to affluent families, the families who need the financial aid the least. It makes no sense from an equity perspective.
Well, that's very true. And the other equity perspective, and people are commenting in the chat boxes about students with learning differences. If they have a disability that affects their ability to test, are there lawsuits about that, and how does that come into play?
You're very right, and I see some questions about that in the chat. Fair Test has been involved since the beginning in working with leading disability rights advocates, often through litigation. We were involved in a lawsuit that removed the scarlet asterisk, the flag that indicated ACT and SAT scores that were taken with accommodations. We're currently involved with a lawsuit against the College Board. We're a plaintiff in the lawsuit around the advanced placement mini at-home computer-based garbage exams that were given this past spring, in large part because kids with learning disabilities were simply excluded. It wasn't convenient for the test makers to find a way for those kids to take tests like their regular student peers. And so they had no opportunity to take the test. And that case is now moving forward in federal district court with some of the leading disability rights attorneys in the country pressing it forward. I mean, it's the whole notion of standardized testing in a pandemic when there is no such thing as standardized education or standardized test setting or standardized kids, which there never existed, is insane. And there is no test in the world that is worth risking a single student's or teacher or counselor life in order to take. And so in the past year, we've been major advocates and sort of kept the records of schools that have previously not test optional schools that have become test optional in the pandemic, at least for the high school class of 2021, current seniors.
So can you talk a little bit more about that too? I mean, I know the number of colleges that went test optional this year has been phenomenal. It's like 2/3 of the colleges, right? Or more.
Well, pre-pandemic, there were 1,070 four-year colleges in the country. There are 2,330 total accredited colleges, according to the federal government. So about 45% were test optional pre-pandemic, and that included more than half of the most selective liberal arts colleges, about a quarter of the most selective national universities. Since the middle of March, when the pandemic shut down testing centers and then shut down colleges, about another 600 schools have gone test optional. And that includes essentially all the most selective colleges and universities in the country. All the Ivy Leagues, all the little Ivy Leagues, Stanford, USC, the entire University of California system, the CSU system, on the West Coast, all the public university systems, California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii, they're all test optional. In fact, of all the major public systems in the country, only Florida has continued to require ACT or SAT scores from applicants. So the total number as of today is about 1,680 four-year test optional schools for current high school seniors. And that's about 73% of all four-year schools. And we're probably undercounting. There are many small schools out there who are functionally test optional, who just haven't posted it on their website.
So, and this is a question David's asked and that I was wondering too, we talked about is, are the indications that now that so many of these colleges have gone test optional, are they going to stay test optional? What is that, once the school goes test optional, what are the chances of them staying test optional?
That's a question we get ever more frequently, particularly from people who are working with high school juniors and sophomores and their parents and kids themselves. Certainly all of the 1,070 schools that were test optional before March 2020 will remain test optional. Those were permanent policies. Of those who suspended testing, about 100 more have said that those policies are permanent or for more than 1 year. So large public systems, flagships, University of Connecticut, University of Massachusetts, University of Washington, University of Oregon, Oregon State, they're all test optional either for multiple years or down the road. Places like the University of California system, they're going to phase out the ACT, SAT over 4 years. They're test blind, meaning they won't consider scores even if it's submitted this year. Next year is a little unclear whether it's going to be test optional or test blind. And then they'll be test blind again in 2023 and 2024. So there'll be more than half the colleges in the country will be test optional. How many of the schools that suspended because they knew kids couldn't take tests, for example, the Ivy Leagues or Stanford or Johns Hopkins or MIT or Emory or Duke, those are the ones where we're not certain. Similarly, large public systems that have not gone test optional permanently, say the University of Illinois, we don't know, and they probably won't make that decision for fall 2022 admits for 4 to 6 months.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so many of them said, well, we're test optional this year only, or we're doing a pilot program for 3 years,
right.
Or and as David said too, maybe it's a trigger that they can use to say, okay, we're going to be test option permanent. It gives them a start point to use.
Now, certainly our experience over the years is that schools that adopt test optional pilots of multiple years, 1 year is insufficient to gather data because you have to announce your next year's admissions policy before your newly admitted test optional students have even completed a first term of academic. But if the schools that are test optional for 2 or 3 years, in the past, every one of them that's run a pilot, none of them reverted. Test optional works. From the college perspective, it produces, on average, more applicants, better qualified applicants in terms of academics, more diverse applicants of all sorts, race, geography, academic talents and interests, it's a win-win for colleges, and it's a huge win for teenagers who to take that burden of having to take tests, pandemic or not, off their shoulders and letting them apply to places where they'll know they'll be treated as more than a score.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this year with COVID has really accentuated that and helped us as counselors. I mean, we've always known that, but it's helped students to see that, and universities as well. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the terms that you've used, and it's become much more pronounced in the media right now, is the term test optional versus test blind. Mm-hmm. Can you explain what the difference is? You mentioned that University of California is test blind. California State University system is now test blind. What's the difference?
1 year, yes. Mm-hmm. From fair test terminology, and what we do is usually refer to people as they identify themselves. So if schools say they're test blind or test free or score free, we use all those terms. But those categories, test blind, test free, score free, mean that if SAT, ACT scores are submitted, they will not be considered in the admissions process, period. They're a factor that does not go into the equation in any way. Test optional has historically meant that applicants have a choice as to whether SAT and ACT scores will be considered. Some schools have test optional policies that apply to all applicants. Some restrict it to applicants who meet certain other academic criteria like GPA or class rank. Some are test optional for some programs and not others, typically nursing, or could be a place where tests are required. And unfortunately, there's still a difference in schools that are test optional in admissions, but require tests for so-called merit aid, though test scores don't measure merit. They measure how well you fill in bubbles on a Saturday morning. So in terms of test blind, score free, test free schools, of the 1,680 total, 68 fall into that category. There was only one pre-pandemic, that was Hampshire College in Western Massachusetts. And the bulk of test blind colleges and universities are in one state, California, where the 23 California State University campuses and the 9 undergraduate UC campuses, 32, are test blind for the coming year. It's a next step for many colleges that after Cornell, for example, went test optional for all applicants, but some schools within Cornell were comfortable saying, no, we don't need test scores at all, and we won't look at them.
Well, and another group that often has test scores required where other students aren't required is the international students as well, right?
Yeah, and that pre-pandemic, that cut both ways. There were some schools where test scores were required for U.S. applicants, but not for international applicants. And some the other way around. They're required for international applicants and not for U.S. applicants. Fair Test believes that a test optional policy should apply across the board for applicants from all backgrounds, including homeschooled. But colleges need to find the policy that best meets their goals, their mission, and the type of student body they want to attract, and based on their own internal research. So we recognize that there will be cases where schools get applications from countries where they don't have much experience reading grades and other academic portfolio information, and think that they need test scores as well. We hope that that's just a temporary position and that they move on to fully test optional.
Well, what about for athletes? Isn't part of the reason test scores are required for athletes is because the NCAA or the eligibility centers require them?
So absolutely, and it's been a huge issue for Fair Test over the years. We were involved in a lawsuit instigating a lawsuit against the NCAA around the initial eligibility requirements. I mean, who appointed the NCAA, the National School Board? Well, they weren't elected. they report only to themselves, yet they decide what are legitimate courses and what are testing requirements, and try to override the admissions criteria of individual schools. This year, the NCAA has suspended its testing requirements, and we are working with a group of primarily African-American coaches and counselors at the college level to try and make that permanently. It's not an admissions criteria for the school. It is a rule that it's called the initial eligibility rule that screens out athletic eligibility and athletic related scholarship aid. And, going back to the lawsuit that we helped initiate, it's again a set of rules with profound racially disparate impacts. But maybe fading. Watch this space for new developments.
What about, and so many people, I'm pulling from everybody's chat. So yep. I love having that we have such an active chat. You guys are doing a great job. What about service academies? They didn't waive the test, and what's going on with that? Are they being scrutinized for that? Or do you think with a new administration that might be looked at? What are you hearing on that?
Yeah, I mean, public universities in general and the service academies are governed not by academic leaders who make decisions about admissions requirements based on mission and attractiveness and other data. They are governed by politicians who, as we see, make decisions based on ideology and political considerations. That's why a place like Florida has not gone test optional yet. It's the legacy of Jeb Bush and the Bush family to test and punish leaders at the K-12 level. In fact, the military academy, the Naval Academy, and the Coast Guard Academy did kind of grudgingly suspend testing requirements, saying, if you really can't take the test, then we'll consider you, but maybe you should try and take the test before you enroll. So it's unclear how optional their policies really are. But that's not a decision made by admissions leaders at West Point or Colorado Springs or Annapolis. It's made by Congress and the U.S. Defense Department.
Interesting. And that points to a lot of things, that it's not, the decisions are being made are not in the educational best practices or models and programs. It's based on political or other types of things. So,
it's not to say that private colleges are immune from internal politics, but when you have, you watch the activities of the last month or so, state legislators are often motivated to act by factors other than evidence, shall we say.
Very true. Well, and I teach for UCLA, and I have several of my UCLA students on, and oftentimes very surprised to, we look at, as counselors, advisors, we look at this process as a very holistic, altruistic type of thing. We're trying to help kids to be able to get the best education possible. And it does come as a shock sometimes that it's not always about the students. There's a lot of other factors that come into this whole process. And in college, higher education is a business, and you're trying to meet those business needs. So
that's right. And in fact, the test optional debate doesn't take place in a vacuum. In addition to COVID, you have, the contraction of the higher education realm in the last several years because of economic forces and a demographic decline. The number of kids coming out of high schools for the next 10 years are going down, particularly in some parts of the country, like the Northeast and Midwest. And schools need to respond to that in order to maintain their existence. So, we don't deny that takes place, but we try to focus colleges on the hard evidence. And that means data generated by, if they're considering going test optional, first by peer institutions, published by those schools. I saw somebody ask, why do schools like Goucher, who have been test optional for a number of years, request test scores at matriculation? That's so they can do the research that is extremely important internally to prove the test optional works as we say it will. And it's very important to share with other institutions. And we then encourage colleges to look closely at the evidence about what test scores do in their own decision-making process, and that when they become test optional, to do ongoing studies of the impact of that policy. I mean, this isn't some cult or religious commitment to test optional admissions. It's an evidence-based initiative, and we want more evidence.
Well, and I know, colleges have done studies on that. Steve Syverson from the University of Washington, Bothell, and a group of other college personnel have done a study on the test optional and the students, basically the quality of the students and how well they do in college using a test optional policy versus not. And they found that they actually end up with better students, or they're saying they're not losing in terms of the students and how well they progress and our retention or any of those things that are used as reasons for the tests in the first place.
Yeah, that was a meta-analysis done of several dozen schools and tens of thousands of students by Bill Hiss, who had been the admissions dean and VP at Bates, and Steve Syverson and others. And it's available for free on the NACAC website, nacacnet.org. And you can Google Syverson or Hiss at that website, and you can find it. Very, very illuminating. We work closely with the researchers. I've been on panels a number of times with Steve and Bill Hiss, and they are great leaders. And they are the best spokespeople for test optional admissions. Are not outside testing reformers that we sometimes like to think we are, but people within the profession who have done the job, seen the data. Syverson was previously the admissions dean at Lawrence University in Wisconsin and lived with test optional for decades before he went to University of Washington Bethel. Yeah,
and John Beckenstadt from University of Oregon too has been such a proponent.
I've been on more panels with John than either of us cares to count. John was the associate vice president at DePaul in Chicago, one of the first urban private universities to go test optional. And he's now led the way for Oregon State and then the entire University of Oregon system to go test optional, where he's a VP at Oregon State in Corvallis.
Yeah, that, and Caleb mentioned that too. It's Oregon State. I said University of Oregon, but no, Oregon State. So
very, very important. John's a Facebook friend and a Twitter friend, and very important that it's Oregon State, not University of Oregon.
Yes, I stand corrected. Thanks. So the other question, and there are tons of questions. We'll turn to these in just a moment, but one of the things that people are wondering, how are the test prep companies, test companies like College Board and ACT reacting to all this?
Well, both the ways you said it are interesting. But, the College Board, I think in particular, scrunched up and said, we got to face reality, that the tests are not available, and their public statements at least have been at least admitting that test optional is a necessity for many institutions in the reality of COVID test site closures. ACT is a different story. I mean, if you look at the economics, College Board's $1 billion a year company. Less than half their revenue comes from the SAT. Their major product over the last 5 years is the AP exams, which is why they rushed a defective AP product into the marketplace after COVID, and why we're suing them for $500 million, is that they had collected that money early in the school year and didn't want to give a cent of it back, so they had to give something that pretended to be a test. Mm-hmm. But they have enough financial cushion to deal with the loss of what appears to be about 900,000 fewer test takers for the SAT so far this year. and at $50 a pop, that's $45 million. ACT is a different ball of wax. ACT is very dependent on its test, doesn't have another major product. And the cancellations hurt it badly. Huge number of layoffs, staffing cutbacks. You can find out if you call up ACT's alleged customer service and spend days on the phone before you get somebody in the Philippines who is given a crappy script to read and doesn't solve your problem. The president of ACT vaporized in midsummer, just disappeared, gone. And they had an acting president, lots of other folks there. The head of assessment research, gone. They were very badly hurt by it. Test prep companies, many have been totally obnoxious. And where college admissions officers say in good faith that test optional means optional. And about 600 admissions leaders signed a statement to that effect on the NACAC website. Many smaller test prep companies are saying that's a lie. College admissions officials are scamming you, and that higher test scores really matter a lot. And they're trying, quite frankly, to scare kids and their parents and counselors into thinking that they have to do test prep and take tests in order to remain competitive. We've been on panels, I've been on panels with literally hundreds of college admissions officers. I think they're honest people. When they say optional means optional and that you'll neither be advantaged nor disadvantaged, I think that's true, despite what the test prep's self-serving messages might be.
So and this question somebody posed, and it's one I've had too, University of California is talking about, they've gone test blind / test optional, and they want to create their own tests. What are the chances of them really being able to create a test that's as valid, that's equitable, as opposed to what the College Board or ACT does?
That's a real good question. And, we wish them luck in that endeavor. The reality is that the College Board has been in business for nearly 100 years. In my experience with Fair Test, the SAT has been comprehensively overhauled to an all new, improved SAT with tailfins at least 5 times. And the test has not gotten to that standard of being a better predictor than high school grades, a fairer test, or no longer susceptible to coaching. ACT's been around since the middle of the last century, 70 years or so. They haven't been able to do it. If Californians can make a new test that is fair and accurate and equitable, we'll applaud them. But the practical realities make that very difficult. You can have one test in California and other tests in the other 49 states in the rest of the world. What happens to kids from New York, let alone Saudi Arabia, who want to go to UCLA? Which test do they take and where? There would be huge logistical impediments to that. Many people thought that what California wanted to do was just adopt the state high school test, the so-called smarter, balanced assessment, and make it a college admissions exam, though it wasn't designed or validated for that purpose. We're watching closely. We have some friends on the inside in the process. Personally, I doubt that California will come up with a new test.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm expecting, but the University of California is its own entity, and they feel like they have a handle on a lot of these things. They're very proprietary in that aspect.
Well, the University of California is very important in the admissions world. If you read the best history of these tests, which is called The Big Test by Nick Lehman, published maybe 15 years ago, it was clear that the way the SAT became a national test was by assiduously lobbying in California, which did not require an admissions test except for out-of-state kids until the late 1960s, to make the SAT a requirement. And then the ACT rode the coattails. California is extremely important. The public university system both UC and to a lesser extent Cal State. I mean, UC is widely viewed as the biggest and best public system in the world.
Yeah.
True or not, it has a tremendous influence elsewhere. And the regents, the current regents, and this is a case where politics and ideology, I guess, work in our favor. The regents, many of whom were appointed by Governor Brown, are strongly committed to diversity and equity to serve the types of kids that California is likely to be educating in high schools in the coming decades. And they know that the tests are barriers to equity.
Yeah. Especially here in California, where we're such a diverse population. There is no majority per se anymore.
Right.
We have such a diversity. A lot of comments about tying test scores to merit and merit scholarships. Is there a list of colleges that still tie test scores to merit scholarships?
It's a huge issue for us at the last national NACAC conference before the plague, so the 2019 NACAC convention. I led a panel specifically about how to decouple so-called merit aid, academic aid, from test scores. It's a very difficult topic to get a handle on. Individual colleges have dozens of different scholarship programs with different criteria. Sometimes the award criteria are determined by the legacy, the gift, the endowment that funds it. They may include test scores. One of my panelists at the last NACAC conference, Andy Palumbo, who's a vice president at Worcester Polytech, said it took them 2 years to root out all of the test score related scholarships at that college. And it's a pretty small place. I can imagine a place like USC, how many different scholarships they have and what they're tied to. We want to move colleges in that direction. Test scores were never designed to measure, your need for academic money. And that money would be better spent, particularly in the current economic crisis, as need-based aid for kids who have the talent to go to college based on their high school performance, but simply don't have the money because of their family circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and another group that we're going to see a great increase of and have been really impacted by testing is the homeschool. So I'm seeing several comments about that. And like University of California, you can't even get into the UCs unless you take a test as a homeschooler. And so hopefully those policies will be impacted as well, because we have a lot more people going to homeschooling because of COVID.
Yeah, and we understand why colleges, which were test optional for 99% of their applicants, still required for homeschoolers, because there's not a transcript and a history that you can look at and use comparability with previous admits from that place. But yes, colleges are going to have to adapt to the reality that many kids are going to be educated at home. Not just class of 2021, but probably class of 2022 and maybe beyond.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if colleges aren't using test scores, then what are they using to determine, especially if you're a highly, selective school where you're admitting 10% of your applicants? What are they going to use to determine admissions?
Well, remember, 1,070 schools, including places like the University of Chicago, Brandeis, George Washington, half of the top 100 liberal arts colleges were test optional pre-pandemic. They were able to make high quality, fair admissions decisions based on all the evidence that's in an application portfolio. That's primarily academic performance in high school. Even the test makers admit that high school grades, with all their variation and all the differences between high schools and all the differences between courses within a high school, they're still better predictors of undergraduate success than either test is, which shows how really lousy the tests are as predictors, because people know there's that kind of variability. And even within the same high school, one kid can be taking very rigorous AP courses and another taking the equivalent of basket weaving. All that washes out, and grades are better than test scores as a predictor, and substantially fairer. And that's been found in the UC system admits as well. But so you look at grades, course rigor, class rank if it's available, information about the high school, the students' out of class activities, sports, community service, clubs, leadership, family background, religious service, obstacles overcome, to make a holistic, comprehensive judgment of what, who is likely to succeed. And experienced admissions officers who have adequate time, and that's a problem for schools converting just this year in a rush, who have adequate time to read portfolios, can make those decisions very well.
So it sounds like, and there are a lot of comments about grade inflation, some high school, if you're a real rigorous high school, maybe a B+ is a really great grade, and other schools, everybody has A's, there's, a grade inflation. So you're saying that all kind of washes out in the end?
Notwithstanding all those truths, high school grades predict undergraduate success, which means graduation, much better than test scores do. I mean, that, school admissions offices individually have found it. Independent researchers have found that, and the test makers grudgingly admit it.
So I know we all have, as a counselor, we all have students who maybe aren't performing at their best in school. Maybe they're getting B's or C's and stuff, so their grade point average isn't as well, but then they go take the test and they test really, really well. So then that sounds for them like having the tests are a benefit. And if those are eliminated, then where is that going to put them?
Well, I mean, that's always been an argument by the testing companies that, the test allows them to find diamonds in the rough. And Fairtest has long argued that what test optional does is allow kids like that to submit their test scores and show, that they have a particular talent. The reality, over the years in talking to lots of admissions officers, is that they're very suspicious of kids like that in most cases. They're concerned that kids who are slackers in high school are not going to magically become academic stars when they get to college. That these may be very talented kids, or talented in the set of skills that a multiple choice fill in the bubbles test can measure, but that they don't have the other non-cognitive characteristics, the ability to self-discipline, to collaborate, to think creatively, that is needed for larger academic success. And so they're really wary of low grades, high score kids in many cases. They may take a flyer on such a kid who has other things in the portfolio that make her attractive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as Lisa says, consistency trumps a single day, experience. So, a single day success. So, so the next question then is, what do we tell? And I'm seeing this question. It's a question I have myself: is what do we tell juniors? So our seniors, they're test optional. They've, applied. I will say I found, because this year is test optional, my students applied to more colleges. They thought, oh, well, now it increases my chance, my opportunity. And like, I have a student who applied to 28 schools that I know of. He might have applied to more. And so is that something that the colleges want, or, how is that going to impact? I'm sure, and with Common App and Coalition and other applications, it just furthers that.
I don't think, the highly selective, what we call standard, really want more raw applicants per se. They want more high quality applicants. Every college does. it's hard to know what to say to tell juniors right now beyond what I said earlier, that we know for certain that more than half the colleges and the universities will be test optional or test blind for fall 2022 admission. And that includes some, highly selective places like the UC system. But it's, among the other ambiguities that we've had to get used to in this, unprecedented year. Unfortunately, juniors are going to have to wait a while for some clarity. Does that mean running out and taking a test right away? Probably not. If they want to know how well they can do on the SAT or ACT, if they turn out to be required, buy a test prep book for $20 or go in your counselor's office and take a practice test and see how you do. But don't get all riled up about test scores, because they're not going to matter at many places in 2022. And it may be that they're not going to matter at the vast majority of places. It's just too soon to make a firm judgment, particularly about the most selective places, the Stanfords and USCs and Ivies, Hopkins, Emory, Duke, MIT. Don't know.
Yeah. And that's such a key thing. I mean, and people are talking about, and I've had students too in California who've, flown out of state. I mean, I've had students go to Oregon and Nevada and Arizona to take these tests. And, and so if they can register and take them, I'm trying to say, well, you maybe register for May or June. It might be possible to have tests available then, but you are not going to be disadvantaged if you don't take the tests.
I think, that's extremely dangerous. I think it's the result of, in some cases, test prep controversies scaring kids. I mean, why, in the middle of a pandemic, in the worst, the worst time of the worst pandemic in history in this country, would you get on an airplane and go to a hotel and sit in a room with kids you don't know? It's just not worth the risk to do that. I mean, it's easy to say my kid is grown and flown and, went through the process, graduated from a test optional college ultimately, but it's, I read those stories. There was a story, USA Today had it earlier this week in Illinois. Taking the test taking the SAT or ACT is a graduation requirement. And a kid from an immune compromised family went to school grudgingly after trying to opt out and came back with COVID. I can't think of the right word to describe the foolishness of that kind of behavior. But we read about it and hear about it all the time.
Mm-hmm. And so we're getting comments too about international students.
Mm-hmm.
Will the colleges waive this because the international students have less opportunities to take the test? Right. Even now, students in China or other Asian countries have to fly someplace to take, they go to Hong Kong or other countries to take the test. So do you see the colleges applying that to the international or any of the other groups that we've talked about, homeschool, athletes, learning differences? Are they going to be able to apply it across?
International is particularly complicated because of all the visa and related problems from the current administration, which may or probably will change down the road. I would think that colleges are pragmatists. International students are often full pay or high pay. They will find a way to accommodate them. And even if that means if you restore testing for some set of domestic applicants, it's likely to be not required for international applicants if they can't take the test. But again, it's one of those things that's hanging out there to be resolved in the next 4 to 6 months.
Yeah. And that's, none of us has a magic ball that we can look into, but, looking at past behavior and past experiences. And I agree with you, colleges are pragmatists. They want to have students. And So, they don't want to create undue burdens or barriers for students. So
Well, at some level, there are businesses who need to put paying butts in seats in order to pay the faculty.
mm-hmm.
My wife was a public college professor. I mean, it's, I'm for paying students.
Yeah. So what about using AP scores or things like that instead of SAT or ACT scores for some of these, merit scholarships or things?
I'm sure the College Board would love that. Look, the reality is that there are still a huge number of schools in the country that don't offer AP or offer only 1 or 2 APs. And those schools tend to be in under-resourced communities that can't afford to train and have a teacher teach a smaller class and don't have the resources for labs and whatnot. And so relying heavily on AP, IB would present even greater equity concerns. There are also practical concerns. For high school seniors, AP scores are not available until the tests are given in May of that year, and they're not available in a timely manner for the admissions process. So you'd only have AP scores for underclass members, and that would also be a skew that would probably correlate strongly with affluence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would say, I think not likely to happen. I mean, APs are not designed to be an admissions test, and they're rarely used as such now.
So then, and there's other comments in here too, and I see we're like quickly running out of time. You can tell, Robert, this is a very, topic that's very near and dear to our hearts. And
the comments and questions are just great. And thanks for those who fill in my words about kids flying off to take tests. Insane is a good word.
It is. Does this trickle down to graduate? Are we going to start seeing some of this effects in like GMAT and GRE and LSAT and some of those?
It's already happened. It's partly a bandwidth problem. Starting last year, Fairtest helped launch what we call the GRE exit movement, Grexit, like Brexit. And it was started off oddly, I thought, in a number of STEM graduate programs. And it has exploded across the country this year with many, many graduate schools dropping GRE requirements, both temporarily and permanently. You can find the link on our website, fairtest.org, to a Grexit list. It's much harder than undergraduate. Undergraduate school has one admissions policy. Graduate schools, every sub-program has its own policy, and which may or may not require test scores. This week, I saw on the very good GMAT website called Poets and Quants that about a third of business schools are now GMAT optional. LSAT, not so much. Reason being that the Law School Admissions Council requires the LSAT as an accrediting factor to be a law school, but that may be changing over the years. And we're working with a group of medical students around MCAT optional, which is only applies right now to a handful of schools. But yes, I think you'll see it trickling up to graduate schools as well.
Yeah, I think, and that's where your role at Fairtest and our role as counselors, as advisors can really contribute to that, and just helping to sound the horn and the drum that, this impacts students and it doesn't make for a better student. So I have one more question that we're going to address, because we've been talking about it coming to the US side, but for our students, and Becky brought this up, going to applying to colleges in Europe, like UK, they're requiring, they have A levels or they want IB scores or AP, and they're not holistic admissions. They just say, Here, send us your scores and we're going to admit you based on your scores. So do you see that US test optional kind of filtering through to some of these other systems and maybe making an impact there?
Well, I know it's been an issue in the UK because they haven't been able to administer some of the tests that they regularly use for internal in-country admissions. I don't know the answer to that in terms of admissions for U.S. students, at least not yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. So, and the comment is European schools are incredibly score and grade based. That's very true. I know. So this gives me a great point. You guys see, I have a new background. I'm so excited. I have a new computer with a very good camera. So now I can do backgrounds. And I'm wondering if anybody knows, some of my international people, where this college is that I am. I will tell you it's in Europe. And I will tell you it's in the UK. But when I went and visited the UK last spring, before COVID hit, one of the questions I asked at all the UK schools that we visited was, how do you handle college classes? Because so many of our students are doing concurrent enrollment, and they didn't know what to do. They had none of them really had a policy for how to handle a high school student who also has a college class. And so I found that very interesting. And they were very, they were like, well, that's a really good question. We're going to have to look into that. But I asked that question at every single college. So, they're changing, and they're going to have to adapt too, because of the cost of education here in the US has grown so much. Now our students are finding that they can spend less to go to other countries, and other countries, because of our whole political and other, visa and immigration, all those, they're not coming to the US as much. And then of course, a whole other topic about our Chinese student and Asian students. So, it's not just a US issue, is it? It's a global issue.
Mm-hmm. So it is. I mean, and again, pre-pandemic, we were seeing a reduction in the role placed on admissions tests in countries like Japan and Singapore, where they had been the sole, was pure rank order selection, and that's being reduced supposedly in China as well, which is, if you look at the histories, where all this kind of selection testing began centuries ago. But it's, everything has been accelerated and confused by the global COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, and it is, in a way, it's good, because it's given us like the shock treatment, and it does open up the conversation. And, so many of these colleges went test optional, test blind, and, we're going to see the repercussions. So, Robert, many people are saying we need a part 2, so we're going to have you come back.
We're available down the road. I did put together a slideshow that Cyndy is going to make available with the copy, the tape of this recording of this session, that has some more of this data on there. And much of this information is available on our website, www.fairtest.org. And you can support our work there by clicking on the donate button during the holiday giving season.
And this is, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is your Fair Test, birthday celebration this year. You're celebrating 35 years, right?
That's right.
And what are you trying to do with that, with your?
Well, we had plans for a gala event, whatever. But did everybody else? Events overtook us, and what we spent the first 6 months of the pandemic scrambling to try to keep up with interest in test optional admissions and talking to schools and promoting it. And our website visits tripled some months. Instead of doing 30 or 40,000 visits to our test optional visits, we're doing 100,000 a month. So it's just overwhelming keeping up. One of the things we're doing for the anniversary is we're trying to push to have K-12 testing in public schools suspended or waived for another year. We just launched a petition. Again, you can see it on the website, to have the federal government and states suspend their testing mandates because you can't give a standardized test in such non-standard conditions when public school kids, some are being educated at home, some hybrid, some in class, many emotionally just uprooted by the pandemic. It doesn't. Test scores will tell you absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
So Texas just suspended theirs. Texas is going to still test. They suspended any accountability attached their system of A to F school grades, and I think we're going to see that pretty much everywhere. That there'll be some testing, but it won't have any impact. In which case, why do it?
Right. And that's a whole nother conversation too, is testing of the, K through 12 and how does that connect to free and public?
Well, and I think we'll see the new administration being pressed to address that very soon.
Mm-hmm. Robert, thank you so much. There's been way more comments and contributions than we've been able to address, and everybody, you guys have been so great, and the comments have fostered each other, which is what I love. I will have the slides available on my website. I will send you the link to this afterwards. This is also in a podcast version. We'll have the link to the slides and the podcast as well. Robert, have a wonderful holiday, and thank you again for being with us today. This has been
Thank you all for what you do. Counselors are on the front line, and it's a tough job always. In this year's, it's unbelievable. Hang in there.
We will. Thank you again. Thanks, everybody. This is our last webinar for Friday Forum for December, and we'll be back again in January. So be watching your emails, and you can always go to my website at www.cindymcdonald.com. I'll list them there. We're going to be talking to Ethan Sawyer in January. And we're also going to do something with Jamie Dickinson on the PPP loans. If you're figuring out how to repay them or how to work on the forgiveness part, we're going to cover that. So those are both coming in January. Everybody, thank you. Robert, thank you. And everybody take care.
Thank you.